I'm here with Tasneem Essop from the Planning Commission to discuss matters in relation to the just transition. I just thought I would spend just a few minutes to make some general remarks, and Tasneem will do the presentation on behalf of the Planning Commission, but more importantly also through her experience and her own work. The first remark I want to make is this is a very important commission for our country, nationally and also globally. Secondly, the problem we're dealing with has been created by us, human beings, and it should be accessible to our intellect to solve it. It couldn't be impossible because we created it. For a start, the human body really is an ecosystem package of energy and greenhouses emission. We ourselves, in the way we are designed, we are a package of energy and greenhouses emissions ourselves. And I come, I think, to this commission just to make this remark from a planning perspective and also as a senior, because I happen to chair Eskom, which is one of our great, so I'm both culpable and trying to formulate a solution. But those are just the general remarks. And like you, Chair, I'm a pensioner in my everyday life, and I've been requested to come back. The second point I want to make is that the whole concept of sustainability goes back 35 years ago. It started in 1986, precisely. And it has acquired different names over time. Just to be a little bit more specific, I think it has been made more sexier through the SDGs that were approved in 2015, and then through the Paris Agreement that was signed in April in 2016. Those are the historic records that made it more prominent and more urgent. But let's remember that the National Planning Commission of South Africa was appointed in 2010. And this whole issue of the environment, of low carbon emissions, of sustainability became a central piece of the development of the national planning, the National Development Plan that was approved in 2012. So as a country, and I keep saying this, we were ahead of the pack of the UN. We were ahead of the Paris Agreement. And as I think Becky said, let's not find ourselves behind people when we started being ahead. And I think he made that point indirectly. I just want to emphasize it. So the third point I want to make is that we live in a world of globalization. We are interconnected. We live with each other as if we are just neighbors, although we are not together. The downside of globalization is that it comes with crisis. At the moment, we are dealing with, obviously, an epidemiological crisis of the COVID pandemic. That's a crisis. The environmental crisis is what this commission is supposed to address, which is the climate change or the just transition. We have had political crisis, both within our country and in other countries, as a result or as a consequence of globalization. But what is important, which is what this commission is being appointed to do as leaders, is to see opportunities in the crisis. Not to wallow in the crisis, but to see opportunities for the nation to move forward and find solutions and innovations to solve, as I say, a man-made problem. But as Becky said again, we are going to be tested, or you are going to be tested on the basis of implementation. We can all have ideas. We can all find solutions, but it's how we implement them and make them real on the ground. The fourth point I'm making is that the just transition or the climate change, it's a very complex matter. It's not as simple as it looks. So it's going to require an interdisciplinary approach, which is what I think this commission seems to be made of. It's going to be requiring a multidisciplinary approach, but more importantly, it's going to require that you cross the boundaries of disciplines, transdisciplinary. So you can't lock yourself in the disciplines, you must cross them because you are dealing with an integrated, complex problem that requires a systems approach. And I wish you all the luck. This is what we had to confront, I think, in the National Planning Commission. So in brief, Chair, I'm going to introduce Tasneem Essop, who has been a commissioner for over 10.5 years in the National Planning Commission, who has taken this within our commission as her almost like a job and a focus job. And she has done all that is needed, I think, to discuss and to map a way on the just transition that we're facing. I'll hand over to Tasneem as a colleague to describe her experience and the role, and sometimes how she had to cajole us in the commission to understand the critical importance, I think, of low carbon emission, of the just transition, and all that comes with it, because it acquires different names, climate change and so forth. So the floor is yours, Tasneem, and just give them all that we have been discussing in our commission. Thank you, Chair, and then we will talk a little later.
Thank you, Prof, and thanks for that introduction. Greetings to you, Chairperson Valimusa, to all the ministers present here, and to the commissioners particularly. And also, of course, greetings to all the observers in this call. I really want to express the NPC's appreciation for the commission affording us the opportunity to present the work that we've done as a commission in terms of the broad issues of sustainability and transitioning to a low carbon, climate resilient economy and society, which emerges from Chapter 5 in our National Development Plan, as Prof said, and that plan was adopted in 2012 and supported widely throughout the country and adopted by Parliament itself and Cabinet. So it is really going to be a great pleasure to present not the Chapter 5 itself, but the work that we subsequently did in terms of the just transition. And I want to say that just sitting through this morning's presentations and listening to all the different stakeholders talking about, what their reflections are and where they're planning to go to is hugely encouraging, because as you can imagine, in 2011, when we started drafting this plan and dealing with climate change, it was not top of the agenda issue. It was still a matter of a big conflict between stakeholders, and the approach we adopted then as a commission to draft Chapter 5 was an inclusive stakeholder process, to the point, in fact, where we managed to build consensus with very, very diverse social partners, reaching consensus at least about a set of principles, a set of guidelines that should direct us in the work towards planning for a just transition. So building off the plan and the first commission's work, we recognized that the plan itself and Chapter 5 was not a detailed plan for a just transition. It was really a high-level framing chapter for work that still needed to be done. When the second commission was appointed, I was fortunate enough to be brought back into the commission and was able to continue that work. And the second phase of the commission's work really was about developing this plan that we foresaw in the chapter of the development plan, and that is planning for a vision and pathways for a just transition in South Africa. The way we approached this was through a social partner-driven process, and recognizing that the big debates that we had during the drafting of the plan required the leadership of our key social partners in the country and their decision-making powers. So the initial thought was to do something very similar to this setup of this commission, to get the 4 social partners around a table in a process that would just knock out all the differences and build consensus about some of the very difficult areas that, of course, this commission will also now have to grapple with. When we convened that first meeting, we were challenged as a commission to take a different approach. And essentially, those social partners attending the first gathering said to us that the very concept of a just transition and achieving justice in a transition would require a far more inclusive process, and that the process itself has to be just. And that really made us go back to the drawing board, think about the way we wanted to run this process as a commission, and we took the advice and guidance of the social partner leaders in that first meeting. And we then restructured the process to be a bottom-up process of social dialogue, social partner dialogue, and we held these dialogues in every single province of the country. This was a 2-year process. What the first meeting also identified was, that we had agreed already as a commission that we would take an economy-wide, society-wide approach to the just transition. And we did that because we recognized, of course, the energy transition is a critical piece of the transition required in the country. But if we do not adopt an economy-wide approach, there'll be an assumption that, we'll move out of coal, jobs will be absorbed in the renewable energy sector as such, which is absolutely not going to be possible and not the case necessarily, and that we would have to look at an economy-wide approach so that we can look at the absorption of jobs, we can look at the creation of new jobs, the creation of new sectors to help, especially on the front of addressing unemployment. The other important element of the approach we took, and I really want to forefront this in this conversation and put this on the table of this commission. As the National Planning Commission, of course, as you know, the plan identifies 3 strategic objectives for the country. The one is to eradicate poverty. The second is to reduce inequality, fundamentally. And the third one is, of course, to address unemployment. And so with those 3 strategic objectives as adopted by the National Development Plan, the work on the just transition fundamentally centered those objectives as part of the work and the thinking that we did on developing a vision and pathways. And so through these social partner dialogues held in all of the provinces over the course of 2 years, we also held bilaterals with key constituencies like Labour, with the youth. We had the most amazing engagement with the young people. We engaged with the energy intensive users group, and a lot of the members of that group spoke here today, and a number of other bilaterals. And so what we did as a commission, while taking an economy-wide, society-wide approach, was to also focus on 3 critical sectors, without ignoring the fact that there are others that we will identify and work on. But we focused on energy, we focused on land use, and we focused on water. And we adopted a nexus approach to those critical sectors, because as you can imagine, they in combination and in an integrated way have a huge impact on issues of food security, water security, etc. So having that approach, these dialogues then did two things. One, in each of these social partner dialogues, we asked in an inclusive way for our social partners to identify what vision we would have for 2050. We're talking about transitioning, but we should be able to say, where do we want to transition towards? What is that vision? What is that end state by 2050? And so that's the exercise we did. And then we also asked in these engagements for our social partners to identify, well, if that is the vision, and we developed a general vision, and we developed end states for water, land use, energy, what are the pathways that we need to take to get there? So working backward from that kind of 2050 end state, what needs to happen from now? And the now then was in 2017, 2018, or 2019 as a baseline. And then, you know, working backwards and then looking at where we are currently and developing the ideas for what are the critical actions that need to take place to achieve that end state or end states. Now, we've done that work. And so building off all of these very inclusive engagements, social partner dialogues in the provinces and bilaterals, we culminated in a concluding conference, pulling together all of that work and presenting a draft, which I believe, Crispy, and I hope has been shared with all the commissioners as well. And the idea was to start building consensus around some of the key issues that had emerged through this provincial-driven dialogues, and especially in relation to building consensus around what we had then identified as the key areas of disagreement. And there were quite a few. Those have been identified in the document as well. The idea was that we would emerge from that social partner concluding conference, continue trying to build the consensus, and we had all the plans to culminate in a just transition summit that would have been convened by the president in June 2020. And of course, COVID struck. And we could not host that summit, but we have all this work that's been done by the Planning Commission over 2 years with a number of participants, social partner participants in the process, and with unbelievable outcomes as well. Some really strong areas of agreement. Some of them were already pretty surprising, you know, to reach some of those agreements. That includes the 2050 vision as well, which essentially still had areas of debate about whether we'll go to a zero carbon emission 2050 or a net zero. But those were areas that still needed to be clarified. But to a large extent, one of the clear consensus reached in these, at the concluding conference at least, was the acknowledgement and recognition that we would have to phase out coal in this country, and that it would have to be done through a process of a just transition. And here I want to make some concluding remarks about a just transition, because as we have heard, there's so much work being done in the country on a just transition, and this is very encouraging. But as a few speakers, as a few commissioners had actually indicated, it's going to be important for the Commission to clarify what they mean by a just transition. This is probably similar to, you know, when sustainable development became a concept, everybody understood sustainable development in very, very different ways. And so it just became this free-for-all concept. Whereas, as we heard from the General Secretary of COSATU, the just transition emerges out of the labor movement for very particular reasons. And as the Planning Commission, we adopted that concept of a just transition. We broadened the concept to include other vulnerable sectors of society. Because as we know, the transition is inevitable. But what is not necessarily inevitable and is going to be the biggest challenge for this commission to address is the justice component of a transition. How do we ensure justice? There's enough technological solutions, there's enough expertise, there's been so much research done, many interventions in this space. But one important priority that I would like to suggest as the commissioner who's led the work on the just transition through the Planning Commission is this very deliberative need to focus on the justice aspect of this. And for that, again, we have to recognize what the science has actually told us. And so the IPCC's 1.5 degree report, which the NPC has accepted as the basis of its work, is very clear about who are most vulnerable to climate change. Who are those who are going to be most impacted? And there we have to be very clear that those who are most impacted are going to be those who are living in poverty, suffering inequality, those who are most marginalized in society, workers, indigenous peoples, etc. And we cannot ignore that. That is what the science is saying. And so the big challenge about ensuring that when we develop these pathways, that in every, as you said, Chairperson, every decision we make about an intervention or an action that is needed to be true to a just transition, we have to measure that as to how this improves and protects the lives of those who are most vulnerable. Again, workers, working class more broadly, those living in poverty, those living in informality, women, those living with disabilities, etc. So the bias, I would suggest, based on the outcomes of the just transition process that we've been through as the Planning Commission, the bias of such a commission with such an immense responsibility has to be towards securing justice and fairness for those who are most vulnerable. Everything else, of course, you know, there's enough capacity and resources for, you know, many sectors to thrive and get the opportunities. We should be challenged by how we ensure justice to those who do not have justice right now. And with the kind of compounding impacts of multiple crises and the climate impacts added to that, you know, we just saw and witnessed how it was the poor and those suffering inequality who have borne the brunt of a health pandemic. And so too, will be bearing and are bearing the brunt of climate change. Two last points, Chair. At the concluding conference, we made two very practical decisions. Well, three very practical decisions. Based on all of the work that we did and the engagements we had with impacted communities in some of the provinces. So for example, in Mpumalanga, which was the most eye-opening engagement that we had as a Planning Commission with the impacted communities, you know, the issue of justice hits you in the face when you're dealing with impacted communities. You know, here you have mainly unemployed poor communities who's suffering the problems of real air pollution, the worst in the country, who cannot find employment. And when they do apply to the mines and, you know, coal companies, etc., they have to go through medical tests. So they pass all other tests and fail medical tests because of respiratory problems. So they cannot get any jobs. When they look at alternative livelihoods, the water is polluted, the soils are polluted. So how do you find alternative sustainable livelihoods? So yes, Chairperson, I recognize, you know, we have to think big or go home. I think that part of that think big and go home perspective has to be think big about those who are in fact suffering injustices because of all kinds of, because of poverty and inequality in the country that we have not managed to address properly. So we identified Mpumalanga and agreed that Mpumalanga should be the first hotspot, as we called it, area for just transition work and planning, and it could be a pilot. But on the other hand, in our engagements, we also found out that, while the country's been so focused on mitigation and the energy transition and the future of coal workers and coal mines, while our attention was on this, there have been immense job losses already due to climate impacts. So this country going through the huge drought crisis shed farm worker jobs, and just in the Free State, conservatively, 46,000 jobs were lost during the drought. And this doesn't even deal with the other sectors like tourism. And so what we really needing to bring home in this commission as well is to not only be focused on the mitigation part of the just transition, but we have to look at those other sectors who are already vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, which are already being experienced by us and in this country and by certain vulnerable sectors. So we decided that we needed another hotspot that would look at, and the hotspot would be Free State or the food belt, if you want to call it that, but that would look at that dimension. And then the third agreement we reached was that there would need to be immediate work in a social partner-driven way, not by any one particular partner, to look at the development of labor and social protection plans for the closure of coal mines. And we know, and coal-fired power stations. And we know, while we were at the concluding conference, that process of closure of coal-fired power stations were underway already, and that was being done in the absence of any social and labor plans. And the final point, we actually took a decision about, a chairperson at that concluding conference, was preempting this commission, in fact. And we were very excited when the framework at the job summits was adopted and there was going to be this commission being planned for. We agreed as social partners that the work of the just transition, the institutional home for the just transition in this country, should be this very Presidential Coordinating Commission on Climate Change. And we're very happy that this commission has now finally been established. And we are very happy to hand over the work that we've done as the Planning Commission with all the reports available, with the concluding conference outcomes, with the database of over 1,000 participants who were actively engaged in the processes of dialogue. And we stand ready, even though the second commission has come to an end, there's going to be a third commission, and my time as a commissioner is over. I'm sure that I can speak on behalf of the Prof and of course myself. We stand ready to support this commission in any, contribution we can make to the overall challenges that you will need to deal with. So thank you very much again, Chairperson and Commissioners, for affording us the opportunity. Much work has been done. And so to a large extent, we hope that that base that has been set will allow the Commission the freedom to not reinvent things, but to be able to build off what is there already. Thank you very much.